Okay, I'm Shem McDonald from the VicTESOL committee, and it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our second keynote speaker for today, Associate Professor Misty Adoniou. Misty's from the University of Canberra, and she has a number of achievements. She's past President of TESOL Greece and the Australian Council of TESOL Associations. She's currently on the Board of Directors of TESOL International. She was lead writer for the Australian Curriculum's English as an Additional Language document and a contributing writer for the Literacy Continuum and an advisor on equity and diversity in the Australian curriculum. She's a regular contributor to The Conversation, and she's received numerous teaching awards. And she's currently involved in several research projects which are detailed on the VicTESOL website and on Misty's own webpage. I heard Misty give a keynote at the Department of Education's New Arrivals program earlier this year in April, and many of you may have been there. And I was engaged throughout the presentation, not only by Misty's excellent presentation style, but also by her skills in bringing together information about student performances as evidence to support her arguments that more needs to be done. And I'm not alone in being impressed by Misty's abilities. I didn't have to look far to find many positive comments about her on the internet. These included words like passion, generosity, inspirational, always keeping the ESL learner in mind, always there behind the scenes, bringing things to our attention, providing advice, encouraging students and colleagues. Today, Misty's going to talk about the changing role of EALD teachers in light of evolving social and economic circumstances. She will talk about how this role is changing from being a teacher of students to being an instructional leader of mainstream colleagues, as well as being an advocate of EALD students and their families. So will you please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Misty Adoniou.
Thanks very much for having me here today. And yes, I was back down here in Victoria in April doing a presentation at the New Arrivals Day, and if you were there, I promise you there's only 2 slides from that presentation in this one, and I'm coming at them from a different direction. When I was listening to Joe this morning, I was thinking, yes, I can bounce off of what Joe said. So when Joe said that teachers and Teachers Association need to respond to a call to action, if you were enthused by that, then I will enthuse you more to go forth and bring action. And I'm going to do it in a couple of ways. I'm going to show you some of the challenges that we have, as if you didn't already know them, but I want to put them in a big political context so you understand them, because understanding those challenges makes it easier to address them. But I'm not only going to show you the challenges, I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we've won. And it's not quite as dire as what Joe had said, that we have made some good positive impacts in the last 5 or 6 years, but they didn't come easy, and I want to explain to you how they came. So you might have heard in there that I'm heavily involved with teachers' associations and always have been. So born and bred in Canberra, but then married a Greek on that backpacking trip that we all do. We don't all get married when we do it, but I did as I was backpacking through Greece. And staying on there and becoming involved with the Teachers Association there and eventually becoming their president of the TESOL Greece Association, which is a very different kind of Teachers Association than what it is here in Australia. So you're all professionals with professional qualifications, and that's not the case in Greece, as it's not the case in many countries. But they are people who are involved in teaching English and want to do it well. And then coming back here and becoming involved with the Australian Council of TESOL Associations, which is VicTESOL's mother body, if you like. So the Australian Council of TESOL Association is the federation of all of the states and territory TESOL associations. And then from there becoming involved with TESOL International, which is the federation of 103 teachers' associations of TESOL around the world. So you can see that, well, I've always been an activist, and I've always tried to find a way for the activism to go somewhere other than my head. And teachers' associations have been that way for me. So if any of you are sitting there and not a member of VicTESOL, after the talk you might be inspired to become a member of your local association. So, good old, the field of English as an additional language. I asked this question maybe 5 years ago now. I said, have we finally come out of the wilderness? Because for a good 20 years, we were firmly in the wilderness. From the time of the Howard government, in fact, we had become subsumed under the heading good literacy teaching. And really, we were no longer seen either by government or policy or departments as being something quite specific. It seems that anybody could do the job that we did because it was just good teaching. And the number of times I heard mainstream teachers tell me that, oh yeah, but it's just good teaching, isn't it? And that was such a risky place for us to be. We lose a lot when people think that our job is just good teaching, because it's so much more than good teaching. In fact, we lose our identity, and it was back in 2001 that the wonderful and late Penny McKay warned us all of what happens when an EALD field loses its identity. So, in summary, she says, the learners disappear. If we don't have the label anymore, then they disappear. They simply disappear in the statistics. And in fact, they have disappeared in the statistics. So when NAPLAN results come out on Wednesday, which they will, last year's NAPLAN results come out, EALD won't be evident because they'll be subsumed under LBOTI, the language background other than English category. And governments around the country, particularly my state, my territory, ACT, but other states do it as well, will claim the high scores of the LBOTI learners of evidence that they don't need to fund more in the field of EALD. And of course, EALD learners are not the same people as the LBOTI category. So in Canberra, the LBOTI category outperforms the non-LBOTI category, so the language background other than English category, and it outperforms it because they are proficient bilinguals who've come in as the children of the diplomats, of the CSIRO scientists, of the ANU academics. They're my children. So the LBOTI category clearly hides the EALD category, and the EALD category needs to find its way back into those big national reporting statistics. Otherwise, they disappear completely. Because, in fact, they are the EALD learners, and so they are the students who need support in order to perform in standard Australian English. They are the low performers in the NAPLAN. So if we want to improve NAPLAN scores, which is apparently the name of the game, then we would want to put more money into those EALD learners. We can't do it unless the field is named. And once we start losing those learners as named learners, then of course we start losing the named teachers. Because, I don't know, couldn't the literacy coach do that work? Couldn't we just put that great teacher that we have down on prep on that with those kids? So we start to lose the actual expertise of the field when we lose the identity of the field. And of course, this is going to have a negative impact on the kids themselves, who will begin to see themselves in completely deficit terms as kids who don't do the same as what the other kids in the class are doing, without understanding why they're not performing in the same way. And of course, that's exacerbated by the fact that they get sent home with those A to E reports that report them as D, because they're not at C level, and just understanding themselves to be people who can't perform. And of course, if you understand yourself like that in Year 3, then you will identify yourself like that for the remainder of your schooling. It's very difficult to break others' expectations of you. And then, of course, that has a negative impact on the parents, who then can only see their children as failing because that's the report that comes home that tells them that their child is failing. And that begins to impact the kinds of schools that these kids go to, because this national competitive reporting changes parents' decisions about where they send kids, and we start to get a kind of a ghetto happening in schools. And all of this is a consequence of an EALD field not able to say who it is and the work that it does. So it's so important that we learn how to do that. So I'm going to tell a story shortly about the Australian curriculum, but I'll start with the end first. So this is a slide you would have seen if you came to the other presentation that I gave in April. So it's very hard to find your identity either as a teacher or as a student in the Australian curriculum when you consider who wrote the Australian curriculum. So you'll know that the curriculum underwent a review the year before last, and these were the reviewers: Mr. Kevin Donnelly, Mr. Boston, and all under the guiding hand of Mr. Pine. So it became quite easy to see how these three gentlemen reworked the curriculum in their own image. And so it is indeed a very white, Anglo-male, middle class curriculum, because they wrote it in the things that were important to them. It's why we upped the presence of Judeo-Christianity in the curriculum as a reflection of what they felt was important and what was missing, and we removed some things that they felt were not important. Now, that's kind of where the curriculum is now, but I don't want you to feel like that's a hopeless place for it to be, because as Joe says, who cares what the curriculum says? We can do our own thing. So the Australian curriculum does in fact have quite a number of opportunities for us to do our own thing, and these are they. There's a really clear diversity statement attached to the Australian curriculum that talks about the importance of diversity and talks about it in positive terms. Oftentimes I find that the most powerful documents to use in your own lobbying at your own school are the cover documents of the Australian curriculum rather than the nitty-gritty. The big rationale aims statements are the ones that you can go and say, this is what it says. And there's a great diversity statement. Every curriculum document also has a great little language statement where it actually says that the language of each curriculum area is different and describes some of the ways in which it's different. That's another place to get your hooks in as an EALD teacher, because let me tell you, as an EALD teacher, you're about the only one in the school who understands how language is different from literacy. So it's a good place for you to settle your expertise. And then there is the EALD teacher resource, which is a substantial document which has a good rationale statement, and if you read it really carefully, there are some very good little points in there that you can take back to your school. For example, it says, if students are in the beginning or emerging phases of English language learning, then they should be receiving specialist EALD instruction. So just take that little part back to your school. So if anybody's finding themselves in a position of being on school camp more than they're actually teaching EALD kids, these are the kinds of little statements that you can find to support yourself. Now, those little windows actually didn't come with the building. So the Australian curriculum did not come with those windows of opportunity inbuilt. Those windows of opportunity were knocked through by you, or at least by VicTESOL and the other TESOL associations in Australia, quite literally. So I'm going to tell you the little story of how it happened so that we have a good, positive starting place for this little presentation that teachers can effect change and have affected change in the EALD space. So it's a little animation that I put together, but I'll narrate it. So it starts with the year, it's 8 years ago now. Starts with the year 2008. And that's when it was decided that Australia would once again have a national curriculum. And so they gathered people from far and wide across the country in consultation forums. And you might have been to some of these. Everybody was there. There were teachers invited, there were bureaucrats, and there were parents were also there. Tellingly, researchers were not there. They're always left out of the equation, researchers. It's like people think they know nothing. So they were the big group that were missing. So what happened? The consultations happened around the country. There were multiple ones, and credit to ACARA for putting these together. And in these consultation sessions, it was nutted out what should be in an Australian curriculum. And they all put their hand up, and the old favourites got their topic in. Literacy, history, math. But there was something missing, and it became very, very clear attending these consultation forums and looking at the early drafts that EALD learners were completely absent from that beginning draft of the Australian curriculum. So 2009, the Australian Council of TESOL Associations got together with all of its member institutions, its member associations, including VicTESOL, and said, okay, we have to do something about this. We cannot have an Australian curriculum that has no EALD representation in it. And so we went back to their draft documents and pulled out key terms. The curriculum was about excellence and equity, and the needs of every student are important. It came straight from their document. So we took that simple message, that very simple message, and we sent it out to all of our political representatives in every state and territory. That simple message. If the needs of every learner are important, where are the EALD learners in this curriculum? And as a result, ACARA, in about 2010, contacted the Australian Council of TESOL Associations because they had discovered something, that the needs of every learner are important, and that EALD wasn't represented in the curriculum, and could we contribute? So we had planted the seed, it had worked, and we were then invited to talk personally to ACARA. It's challenging talking to these bureaucrats and politicians. I know my field, they're busy. I have to figure out how to say important things to them in a 30-minute block. If I'm lucky, 15 minutes. Basically, I understood if I couldn't explain my message simply, then truly it was going to be too complex to work. And so really the whole, once we had our foot in the door, once we had planted the seed, so that they had this idea that EALD was missing from the Australian curriculum, simply because they heard it coming up over and over and over again in those consultations. And then they're thinking, oh, that's something we obviously have to deal with, because they heard that one message over and over and over again. It's very important that you stay on message. As tempting as it is with all of your years of experience to tell them 15 other messages, you have to say one message and say it clearly. Once they heard that message, then they came to talk to us. But even then in that talk, we had to be very clear. What is it? Because this is what they said to us. How are you different from English? We have English. How are you different from English? So we've got a small amount of time to explain to them how EALD is different from English. So what would your answer have been to that question? Particularly when they said to us, you can't say it's about language, because English has, the new English curriculum has a language strand in it. So how are you different from the language strand in English? So we had to be clear and we had to be repetitive about this, just like the message that we had sent out to everybody to start with. To get them even in the EALD space, we had to repeat the message clearly and over again. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to tell you some of those messages that we gave, because they're probably useful messages for some of you who are in schools who just need to convince your principal what your job is. But before I do, I'm going to go back to the bigger space again. It's really important that, so I work with undergrads most of the time, and undergrads don't come into teaching to be political. Overwhelmingly, especially my primary undergrads, come into teaching because they like working with kids. And in fact, they find the thought of being political totally at odds with what they want to do. They just want to be in their classroom with their kids, doing good things with kids. So it's a challenge to help them understand how political the job of teaching is. And it's hugely political. As Joe was saying, unless we can deal with that, unless we can find a way to have our voice in the public debate, then we really will disappear off the agenda. So this little quote from Wiseman stands true, that this public debate about why standards are falling, blah, 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 will continue. And we have to be prepared to step up and speak. And it can be very hard to do that as an individual. In fact, it's almost impossible as an individual. It's hard to be courageous in a school when you're the only EALD teacher and maybe you're only there 3 days a week. So you need to join with other people. And the best people to join with are people just like you. And the best place to find them is in associations like this, that you'll find these like-minded people who want to do that public talk. Associations can do it in a way that teachers can't, because increasingly you are prevented from speaking about anything anymore. Teachers have become part of the Public Service Act, where they're very limited in what they can say individually. So more and more we need associations to speak on our behalf, because it's up to us to contribute those scholarly solutions. We are the ones who know what happens in classrooms. We are the ones who know why children fail, and we are the ones who know what's needed for them not to fail. It's a really odd paradox that individuals in society love their teachers. Individuals in society will reflect back on the Year 4 teacher who just changed their life. But as a society, we seem to have suddenly lost that admiration that we have for teachers as individuals. And we no longer call on them for their advice or input into what needs to be done in schools. It's exactly as Joe says, that education is essentially run by politicians who don't have expertise, and we rely on them finding the expertise. And the question then becomes, how do we become the people that they tap on the shoulder? How do we become those people? So here's another story with a less happy ending. So you might recall this term, Team Australia. So Tony Abbott made this name famous. But the team was actually conceived of right after the September 11 attacks, and was consolidated after the London and Bali bombings. And what happened in Australia was that we introduced the citizenship test. And that really was team membership. Right? Do the citizenship to prove that you're part of Team Australia. And hence it became a citizenship test of Australian values. Prove to us that you are on the team. Know the answers to these questions. And so it became very obvious then what Australian values were, because you only needed to look at the questions to understand what the political system thought being an Australian was. So the citizenship test was an attempt to define a national identity. It's a way to identify un-Australian behaviour. And if you were an Australian, you'd be able to answer all of those questions, all of those sporting questions. And the Australian Council of TESOL Associations put a submission to Parliament when the citizenship test came out. The Greens called for an inquiry into it. And so once there was a Senate inquiry, that allowed ACTA to put a submission in. Now, when you put a submission into Parliament, it's an interesting process. All you do, anybody can do it. Any citizen can do it. You write something up and you submit it. And then the Senate committee, and there's Senate committees made up of a range of senators from all the different parties or independents who are assigned to that committee. They read it, and then the Senate committee gets together and they decide which of the submissions they would like to hear from in person. So ACTA was one of the submissions that they chose that they'd like to hear from in person. So as the president of ACTA, I had to go along to give expert evidence at the Senate inquiry. Basically, the ACTA submission was you've got to pick your message. Really, as I said before, you've got to pick a message and stick with it. So we didn't even really go into the whole questionability about what constitutes an Australian identity and whose values are theirs. We simply went in saying, do not use this as a quasi-English test because it's not an English test. It hasn't been written as an English test, and yet people will fail this test because they can't speak English. So it was kind of a hark back to the dictation test of the White Australia policy. It was impossible to pass the test if you didn't have the English skills, and yet the test had not been written by anybody with any English language knowledge, at least not that we knew of, any English language pedagogy or instruction. So as I went along, it turned out that I was I was first, by myself. I had taken nothing except myself to Parliament House and the inquiry. And immediately following my evidence, the Department of Immigration and Citizenship followed me. And they had brought the person who was to give the evidence, who was the secretary of the department, and they had brought at least 6 department workers who were all carrying folders. And every time the secretary was asked a question, he turned back to them and they went through folders to provide him the answer that he could then give back. So with that context, I'm going to show you a bit of the hand side of what I listened to as if they were asked. So one of the senators asked, we had a submission from the Australian Christian Lobby regarding the desirability of including questions about our Judeo-Christian background. The Department of Immigration and Citizenship Secretary said, yes, this is an area that will be covered in the resource book. I think the Minister, Kevin Andrews at the time, has made it clear in his public statements that the view is that Australia derives its overall values and beliefs back to the body of knowledge derived from the Old Testament. All right, so that's the response. So I'm sure the Australian Christian Lobby just breathed a sigh of relief knowing that that would be the case. In my presentation, I had said it can't be an English test because we don't even know who wrote the test or the resource book that goes with the test. And they were kind of interested in that. So one of the senators actually asked the immigration, who is compiling the resource book? So that's the book that you get in order to study up for the test. And immigration said, it's a government publication that's being prepared. They don't say that automatically. They say that after... And so then the question is, within the department? The Minister for Immigration and Citizenship is overseeing the production of the book. So apparently Kevin Andrews is at home writing the resource book. And the senator asked, so it's occurring within the minister's office? It's an iterative process. It's always an iterative process, isn't it? As these things usually are, the department certainly had input, but the minister has certainly taken the lead in preparing the material. Has the minister had input from anywhere other than the department? I imagine he has. Do you know from where? I do not know the full answer to that question. Partial will do. I know that the minister has consulted with other members of the government. So now I was sitting there thinking, okay, so now there's Kevin Andrews and Tony Abbott and John Howard just kind of gathered together over the cricket. What else could we put in? Question. Have they consulted with any organisations such as FECA, the Federation for Ethnic Community Councils of Australia? I think the answer is no. So I put that there for you to understand how things happen in a democracy that's not a technocracy. So people decide, particularly in the area of education or values, that they know the answers to these things because they went to school and they have values. So this isn't, you simply wouldn't see the same kind of response in health probably, unless it was a doctor who was the minister. But education ministers of all persuasions seem very, very, very certain that they don't need to really talk to experts in education because they went to school and they know how education works. So how do we overcome that kind of big hurdle that we have? And so I'll go back to the way we won the other one, right? So the way we won the other hurdle of, well, hang on, how do you have a national curriculum that has no EALD in it, is to go back and be very simple and clear in your messaging and be united in your messaging. So as an association, you figure out what it is you're going to say and then you get all your members to say it over and over and over again until they think they said it. And that's fine. That's fine. I once heard Laurie Ferguson. So this is how serendipitous things happen. This is why I once heard Laurie Ferguson, who used to be the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, which was attached to the immigration. So he was a Labor minister. And I was at an event, and we were standing around with cocktails, and he was standing there, and I just kind of sidled up because I'm always trying to connect with people who have influence. And he said, "Oh, so what do you do?" And I said, "I teach English as an additional language." He said, "I've got a question for you." And so he asked me a question about why do people say too easy? Was the question that he asked me. Because it's too, and it's too much. So what do they say too easy? I don't know. So I gave some kind of a linguistic response, and then I had an opportunity to give a couple more examples of how language is different if you're learning English as an additional language than if you're learning it as your mother tongue. And I then heard him, maybe 6 weeks later, use my example in an interview. Right? And all I was joyful that he had remembered the anecdote in order to tell it. Because he's going to get the audience, not me. I need him. I need people listening to ministers, not to me. So that's kind of the aim of what we're trying to do. We're trying to give anecdotes to people in power so that they say them. And people say, oh, yeah, that's true. I wonder why it is like that. So what is the simple messaging that we need to do? This is what we need to do. Two basic messages. We have to clearly explain the specificity of our field. And there's 2 key messages. We have to explain to everybody why it's not the same as subject English. And sometimes the hardest people to convince are subject English teachers. who often feel pretty sure that because they know what a simile is, that they know the 12 verb tenses in English. Well, it's only when you tell them that there are 12 verb tenses that they're like, ooh, perhaps I don't know as much about English as I thought. Because they didn't cover that in their literature degree. And then the other message is EALD is not the same as a literacy difficulty. And that's become really prominent at the moment. I thought maybe we had kicked that one to the curb, but this one is really around. It's why principals keep putting resource teachers who are doing both the LD class and the EAL and telling to put these kids together. And the number of programs that are being rolled out that are for Anglo kids with cognitive deficiencies that are being given to EALD learners is increasing every year. So we have to come down hard and clear in these two. Just figure out what our message is and stay on it. Just keep staying on it. And the other thing we can do is this message. To promote EALD, our learners, their assets. So to promote the assets approach. And I know as EALD teachers, we've been seeing their qualities as assets for a very long time, but we still haven't managed, it seems, to convince our mainstream colleagues of that. And we certainly haven't seemed to have convinced the major population of that. So we only needed to hear Peter Dutton say a month ago that it's a pain having refugees because, they don't speak English and it costs a lot of money to get them educated or in a job. So you can clearly see that that's the big political message at the moment, that these people are full of deficits. And at the very same time that he made that announcement, I was up in Darwin where I'm doing a project for the Department of Social Services looking at the orientation programs offered to refugees in Australia. And, gosh, what time is it already? And I doing the project up there, and I was working with people who had just arrived from Malawi, from a camp in Malawi, who'd been from the Democratic Congo Republic, who not only spoke excellent English because the Jesuits had been in the camp for the last 13 years and they had learnt English very well in the last 13 years, but they spoke fluent French as well as Swahili. So, these are people with assets. So we need to give those messages. So we need to speak up, speak out, speak often, and speak clearly. So the sorts of things, I feel like I shouldn't give this example, so I won't. Because I've given it before, to explain that EALD is not the same as a literacy difficulty, because it seems to me that's a key thing we need to address at the moment. So the fact that we say we don't say the aliens came from the Mars, we say the aliens came from Mars. Now, if you're a student with if you're an Anglo student with a cognitive functioning language processing problem, when somebody says to you which one sounds right, you actually can say which one sounds right. If you're an EALD student, it's hard to say which one sounds right because you don't have that intuitive sense of what the English language sounds like yet. It takes years to get that. So those questions that we ask kids, like in running records, for example, what do you think sounds right? These are nonsensical questions for EALD students. They don't need to hear which one sounds right. They need a teacher to explain which one sounds right and why. They need a teacher to explain why we don't use the article in front of Mars, but we use it in front of Earth. These are things that English teachers can't do. These are things that EAL teachers can do. It's how our discipline is different from subject English. I'll skip this one too. So essentially mastery programs, which are appearing in schools increasingly. So Arakoon, for example, is an example of direct instruction, which is a mastery program. All of those mastery programs which have been written for Anglo students with specific learning difficulties, with congenital or cognitive deficiencies, are not suitable for EALD learners. Full stop. That is the message that we have to keep sending out. Otherwise, our kids will be stuck down in these silly phonics programs for a very long time, being rolled out in high schools phonics programs for adolescents, EALD adolescents, who may never be able to get the sounds of English and therefore never move on in their phonics program, when they could very well be learning to read and write in English. Promote an asset-based approach. So make the message loud and clear that EALD students have a linguistic advantage over monolingual students. They are advantaged. The research tells us over and over again they are advantaged. For us to explain clearly what those advantages are. And I just have this little image of this little girl. Can you see her sitting on the floor? She's in the Muritzhaus in The Hague, where I was last year. And there she is writing away, and I was chatting to her, wondering what she was writing about, and she was looking at one of the paintings. So it's a great museum of Dutch masters. And I asked her what she was writing about, and she was writing in English, and this is what she was writing. In the deep, dark forest lived the girl who brought beautiful flowers every day, blah, 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 blah. And I said, so where did you learn English? And she said, I learnt it at school. And I said, where do you go to school? And she said, I go to school in Cyprus. And I said, so do you speak Greek? And she said, no, I'm in Turkish Cyprus. I said, do you speak Turkish? And she said, yes, I learnt it at school. I said, so you learnt Turkish and English at school. I said, what's your language? And she said, I speak Russian. My mum and dad are Russian. And so here was a little example of a little girl sitting on the floor of the Muritz house, writing in English, even though it was her third language. She is the embodiment of what our kids could be if we would only get everyone to look at them differently. Of kids who have these multiple resources. And yet we just don't seem to position our EALD kids like that. Okay. Quickly, these are my kids. This is asset both. So dad is Greek, mum is Anglo. They are at the Louvre in Paris. And, you know, it's unusual for a 10 and a 13-year-old or whatever they were at the time to be excited about statues at the Louvre. But they were. And they were excited because there's a whole display case of the Tanagrean women. So the Tanagrean women are very famous in ceramics and history. And they're excited because Tanagra, so you can see the card that went with it, Tanagra, which is currently a village of around about 250 people, is where their dad's from, where their grandma's from, where their uncle's from, where their cousin lives. That's their history there. And it always strikes me as interesting that my boys have gone through their entire high school life doing history, and nobody's ever accessed that knowledge from my boys, ever. How many missed opportunities sit in our EALD kids' heads? Because we never even bothered to find out what it is they have and where they're from. I'll skip this too because my time is really up. So helping students to find an empowering third space is really dependent upon teachers being able to identify that space. How do you find this space that lets our kids be more than their parents, something more, right? And that's hard when you're a teacher. Have you seen these were around HSBC bank ads? They were all over airports for a while, saying how things are, depending on your perspective, something is different depending on your perspective. So that was a good example. That's a good example too. And this one I blocked out. I blocked out these ones. So what does a backpack mean depending on your perspective? So I don't have time to get you to chat, but certainly for me, the idea was kind of adventure and my youth and backpacking. I could even say marriage eventually, couldn't I? Backpacking around. But of course, if you're a Syrian refugee, then it's loss and fear. If you're a homeless person, it means something completely. It's all of your self packed in one place. So just being able to step outside yourself as a teacher, and EALD teachers are better at it than mainstream teachers. So that's a skill you need to pass on in your schools to get teachers to step outside themselves. So I'm going to finish with this final call to arms, that these windows of opportunities are a reminder that these windows of opportunities in the Australian curriculum were not built into the building. And that means it's dangerous because they could get closed up again. Right? They didn't come ready-made with the building. And they're easily blocked up again unless we persist with our teacher voice. The best way to do that is through your Teachers Association. Now, I'll finish with 2 quotes, and they're from radically different people. So the first quote's going to be from Marx, and the last quote's going to be from Ronald Reagan. So Marx has a great message. His final message to the world on his gravestone is this. Oh, it's back to front, but I've got it here. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. That is your job. Theorists will talk, but you will change. You will change it. And then the last message from Ronald Reagan. He wasn't actually talking about TESOL, as it turns out. But he was saying that once you're elected into government, make sure you stay faithful to the people who put you into government, is what he said. So he had this little phrase. He said, dance with the one that brung you. And I always try to remember that myself as an EALD professional, that I wanted to be an EALD professional because I was passionate about giving these kids the chance they deserve. And sometimes as an academic, you can start to be beguiled by other things. Like once you're an academic, you have to do things like, get published in journals and get your citation rates up and blah, 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 blah. And you can forget to dance with the one that brung you. And I think it can happen in schools as well. So my final message is, dance with the one that brung you.
Misty, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of everyone here. Thank you for reinforcing the importance of what we do and the importance of advocating and articulating the importance of what we do, and for reminding us that teachers can and have effective